Okay.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in to our ongoing Reformation series where we're talking to thought leaders about election reform, democracy, how do we preserve this experiment in self-government, and joining the Veterans for Political Innovation show today is someone I'm really excited to talk to, Dr. Richard Barton, who is an expert in issues affecting democracy and elections. Dr. Richard Barton is a democracy fellow at United America and a professor at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Rich, thank you for joining us.
Todd, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I've been looking forward to this conversation. I've been reading your work for a while. We're going to talk specifically about Louisiana and California. You published a couple pieces through the Unite America Institute talking about the impact of their nonpartisan primary or nonpartisan election systems. We'll get into those and what you learned. But I just want to start with a different question, which is like, what got you into this work to begin with? I mean, there's a lot of things that you could have studied. What has been the entry point into looking at election systems in this country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess it was sort of two things. I mean, it was something that I was sort of feeling myself as a citizen in this country, which was a frustration with the way uh, the political system was. I would say it seemed like it was distorting the sort of like inputs from our society. And what I mean by that is, uh, it seemed like our political system was way more polarized than we actually are as a society. And like if you're watching like television, news media, or you're on Twitter, it might seem like we're actually deeply polarized. But I would say that those are not actually reflective of American society. Like when I go out and talk to neighbors and friends, or I'm at my kids soccer game or t-ball game, um it seems like there's people from different walks of life, different kind of views, who are getting along. And when we do actually talk about politics, people are way more moderate and sort of conflicted and pulled in different directions and complicated than I think the political system gets across. And then as a PhD student, I started studying the public opinion and the survey research on this. And lo and behold, Americans were not nearly as polarized. Like most Americans are actually pretty moderate when you survey them. And so something was happening in that political system that was distorting our views, and I wanted to understand what that was. And so another thing happened to me, which is I was reading research, early research I was done, 1 to 2 decades ago on primary elections. And the consensus among political scientists were actually that primary elections didn't seem to be that much of a factor in driving polarization. And I just thought that really felt wrong. And so I started doing my own research. And over the last 5 years, there's been sort of a proliferation of new research that has really sort of turned that old logic on its head. But I guess that combination of what I came across as a budding scholar and what I felt myself as a citizen within my own community is what led me to this work.
So I'll actually quote you in an op-ed that you wrote, which is, you say this: Congress and state legislatures across the country are more politically polarized today than at any point in modern American history. And here's the kicker: this ideological extremity of our elected officials and their unwillingness to work together is not representative of the general public. Poll after poll shows that most Americans believe they have much in common and want lawmakers to work more closely together. So I guess my question is, why is this the prevailing myth? Who is perpetuating it? And and then this is where it maybe gets a little edgy, and I have my own opinions, but like, what is your theory about how we therefore move beyond it?
Um, so the myth that we are this deeply fractured as a society.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think it's my focus is on how our electoral institutions, particularly primary elections, make our elected officials act more extreme and polarizing than they otherwise would be. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, that's not to say I think things like developments in, the media landscape over the last few decades, I think that those certainly have an impact, but that's not where my research is focused. And I guess as a sort of concerned citizen, it's something I feel like I have a lot less control over. Whereas our election systems is something that we can change, and indeed are changing across the country. And so where does that myth come from? I mean, I think I don't know that it's so much in sort of intentionally created by anybody individually. It's just that what people see when people think of politics, right? They think of the media, the news that they're consuming, right, online or in television, mostly, and they're thinking of the elected officials who are in office, who are the leaders of the political system, and all of those signals sort of suggest that we as a society are deeply fractured, right? And that things are really, really contentious and acrimonious. And I think that's where that myth comes from. And then, if you assume, well, like that's what our political system and our democracy is just sort of reflecting where we are as a society. But I would say that that's actually not the case, right?
This is great. So and this is where we believe, it's incentive systems for politicians to perpetuate the myth of a extreme political environment in which the stakes of losing are so low, because that contributes to behaviors that support their own re-elections and things like that. So, okay. So we're of like mind on that. I want to give an anecdote, and then I want to get into Louisiana. The anecdote is, like, I think if that's true, I worry about well-intended attempts at behavioral interventions amongst American citizens, if in fact Americans are not divided, right? Like, I worry that there's a groundswell of effort to sort of focus on bridging divides. And I kind of am operating in the same thesis. Like, I don't know that it's the American people that we need to solve for as much as it's the political system that we have to solve for. So I'll leave that as a question for our audience. Let's talk about Louisiana, because there's two states in particular that you've studied recently. Louisiana is one, and they've had an interesting primary system going back to the 1970s. And I want to hear, what is their system? What did you learn in studying it? And then I want to pivot and talk about California, because I think California is the top two system known as the jungle primary. Folks have opinions on that. It was new information to me that Louisiana has been operating with a different election system for decades. So I'd love to hear your perspective on what you learned.
Yeah. And it was honestly something I had not considered all that deeply until I started this project with Unite America. And a couple of things sort of popped out. I guess as we were sort of brainstorming, when I started as a democracy fellow at Unite America, we were brainstorming on ideas. And I told you that there was like political scientists sort of point to other places where they think they see, the media environment being one of them, where they think is what they think is driving polarization. And they sort of de-emphasize primary elections for reasons that are probably beyond the scope of our conversation. But what I had noticed was, okay, so Louisiana has long, since the mid-1970s, has had a system where they don't hold primary elections technically. So they have for Congress and the Senate and for the state legislature, they hold a general election in which all the candidates compete directly against each other. All the voters vote. And if nobody gets a majority, 50% plus one, then they have a runoff election, usually in like January. And, there's things that I would improve about the Louisiana system. But what was notable is they don't have a partisan primary election, right? They don't have Democrats having their own separate election where only the Democratic base, right, where progressive voters are deciding who's going to represent the party in the general, and then the mirror image of that on the Republican side, right? And so this became a fascinating sort of test case. And the first thing that I noticed was the same political scientists who have sort of de-emphasized the importance of partisan primaries, by their own measure, Louisiana has consistently been the second or third least polarized state in the entire country, right, out of 50 states. And so that to me was just like a really interesting sort of data point, right? Because and it was an interesting way to sort of challenge a conventional wisdom within my field, because I was using the same data that they had been using. And then I dug deeper into this. So like, what's actually going on in Louisiana? And we did some interviews with people who were political operatives there. We looked into the history of like how this reform came about, which is, I would say, a very random and interesting story that had little to do with good governance. But that has been sort of the consequence has been that Louisiana has created a system that is less polarized, where lawmakers are way more likely to cross the aisle and to engage in bipartisan coalition making. And you can see this. So there's another measure that political scientists have created. They're called state innovation scores, where they look at how innovative is that state legislature in creating new solutions to existing problems. And Louisiana ranks in the top 5 in that measure. All of this was news to me, right? Because when I think of Louisiana, I think of a state that is struggling in a lot of ways. And I think, and still is, right? Between, deep poverty, the sort of legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, and then just like environmental catastrophes with like the BP oil spill and Hurricane Katrina. But a lot of these are like factors that are beyond the political system, right? Things that like even a good political system wasn't able to prevent. And yet, despite these very difficult circumstances that the state is in, despite having, I think it's now the second highest poverty rate, but for most of the 21st century, the highest poverty rate in the country, despite these factors, Louisiana has actually made a considerable amount of progress and a really underappreciated progress. And so to me, the most interesting sort of part of the research project and the paper that we published was we took a deep dive into 2 case studies to say like, okay, what does this actually look like when you talk about like the substance of policymaking and how it affects real people in Louisiana. So we decided to look at healthcare and K-12 education, which are the two sectors where Louisiana spends, the bulk of its money. So we said, like, let's take these 2 important issue areas and see what the state has done. And on healthcare, Louisiana was the only southern state for a long time, and remains the only state in the Deep South to expand Medicare under the Affordable Care Act. And the result of that has been that way more low-income people in Louisiana have health insurance, and that health outcomes are better in Louisiana compared to neighboring, Mississippi, Alabama, neighboring states in the Deep South. And then K-12 education, Louisiana has been a leader in charter schools. And, as an alternative to regular public schools, and continues to be a leader. And I guess I would say, and cut me off, Todd, if I'm going on too long here, but I guess I would say that, like, what's interesting about these 2 areas is, think what you will about Medicare expansion and the Affordable Care Act, and think what you will about charter schools. But here's an issue that has like a center left and like a center right sort of origin story and coalition around it. And they were both like sort of real solutions to deep problems within, health and education in that state. And they have both led to progress in the state. And they were only possible because of bipartisanship within the state. So, you got John Bel Edwards, a Democratic governor, who, championed both these kinds of reforms. And he did so with the support of Republican lawmakers in the state. And what we argue in our white paper, and I think convincingly show, is that even in other comparable states in the Deep South, these outcomes would have been very unlikely, because you would have had, Democrats who had to win a Democratic primary. And, if they had been as supportive as Louisiana Democrats in charter schools, they would have lost a primary challenge to a progressive challenger who had the support of the teachers' unions who oppose these kinds of reforms, right? And the same thing in the Republican primaries. You would have had serious opposition to, which you did in other states, to Medicare expansion, and you wouldn't have gotten that cooperation from Republicans.
Yeah. Yeah. So Louisiana, I mean, the headline is on health outcomes, on educational outcomes. The state is finding a way to sort of do things that look like policy-driven solutions around the local political environment, which allows, and in fact, not just allows for, but incentivizes bipartisan solutioning. And you look at sort of the split screen of other southern states that might, we might call peer to Louisiana, and you get very different politics, right? Performative and sort of reflections of like what the national media environment is suggesting might be necessary. You also have, and you talk about this as well, and I think it's important to give examples of how this cuts both ways, because there can be a prevailing narrative on the right that says this is just good for Democrats and Democratic policies. And I think you holding up the example of like, growth in the charter school movement in a place like Louisiana, which is typically a Republican issue, was enabled under sort of a nonpartisan election system. And you also had some federal electeds speaking for themselves, right, around the issue of whether or not to convict Trump. And you think of Louisiana as being really southern, therefore a very conservative state. And you saw elected officials acting differently and independently. Let's maybe use that as a pivot to California, because California we do think of as a liberal bastion, but it also has a nonpartisan election system. Can you talk about the technical differences between California's system and Louisiana's system, but then also how it's led to different politics in California, maybe as a state that, if Louisiana is the exemplar of a very conservative, what we think of as a very conservative state historically, and how does that compare to a state like California that we think of as a very liberal state historically?
Yeah. So to your first question, the technical differences in the systems are, like, explain the Louisiana system, right? Mm-hmm. So all the candidates run against each other in what is technically the general election, held in November, the same time the rest of us hold our general elections. And then if nobody gets a majority, then there's a runoff election with the top two candidates. In California, there's a primary that looks very much like the Louisiana general, where all of the candidates are directly competing against each other, and all of the voters, regardless of their party affiliation, are able to vote. And so there is no separate race for Democrats running to win their party primary, for Republicans running to win their primary. And that's the common thread across Louisiana and California. And I would say that, like, we can argue about which system is better, and there's other systems out there, like, the Alaska model, a top 4 with ranked choice voting, or a top 5 model. My point of view is I'm still sort of, I don't want to say agnostic. My thinking is still evolving on like what the optimal system is, and it might be different for different places. But the key feature is that they don't have partisan primaries where only Republicans run against each other, only Democrats run against each other in separate elections, right? So in California, all the candidates run against each other in the primary, and the top 2 candidates, the ones with the top 2 highest vote share, with the most votes, they advance to the general election, and just those 2 compete against each other in the November election. And that's regardless of party. And so, sometimes that even means you get 2 Republicans in a red district, or 2 Democrats in a blue district, who are competing in the general election.
Not only sometimes, that's probably usually what happens, right?
It's I don't have the numbers in front of me if it's usually, but it happens a lot. Like, whether or not it's 50% or more, it's somewhere around that.
Okay. And so voters are getting choices. So even if you live in a blue district, you're still getting the choice of 2 Democratic candidates, right? So it's So it's giving voters choices. So what have we learned then?
Sorry, just so it's giving voters choices, and this is something I spent a lot of time thinking about, and this is one of the critiques of this system of the top two, right? Which some people will say that a top four or top five system is much better because you don't have these instances where a party is boxed out of the general election, right? And I think that may or may not be true. I will say that the criticism that the top two, whether it's the runoff sort of system in Louisiana or the top two system in California, the criticism that it's bad because you can end up with general elections with two candidates from the same party. I understand why, if I were a Republican in a blue district and I had the choice between two Democrats in the general election, why that would feel very frustrating. The ironic thing is that is when that Republican in that blue district would have their peak political power, right? Because what would happen in the typical case is if they're in a blue district, they're going to go in the general election and they're going to vote for the Republican, which is like an expressive vote where they can sort of express their dissatisfaction with the dominant party in their district, but there's no chance that their candidate's going to win, right? In California, that Republican in a blue district goes and can cast a decisive vote between the moderate and the more liberal Democrat and actually sway outcomes, right? And it's this feature of the California system that seems to be driving moderation and better representation. So that's a key point that I just want to emphasize there.
I think it's great. And you talk in your writing about California, you say, well, the prospect of a catastrophic default around the debt ceiling should probably have been enough motivation to get federal lawmakers to work together. It appears that the state election rules were a big factor as well. And of the Republican House members from states with nonpartisan primaries, Alaska, California, Louisiana, Washington, they actually voted to remove the debt ceiling. And then when you talk about California, basically that it delivered what the advocates of primary reform promised, which is that new evidence that it reduces polarization, increases turnout, and even improves residents' views of state government. And during a time in which nearly every other state became more polarized, especially in the West, top two is reduced polarization in the Golden State. So the evidence in California is that it's working, that this top two system is working.
The evidence is that it's working. Now, I want to go back to your other question before, which was, thinking of California as a very liberal state. And it's true that the Democratic Party in California has been very far to the left compared to even other Democratic parties in other states. And in fact, before the implementation of top two in 2012, California was by the same measures that I talked about before, where Louisiana was the second or third least. California was the most polarized state in the country, and by like a wide gap. Like if you were to rank order every state 1 through 50, the biggest gap between any two states was California at number 1, and I think it was Colorado for most of the time at number 2. And what's happened over the last decade since top two is that, well, Colorado is still among the top. It's no longer number 1. I think it's number 2 now. But the trajectory has been depolarizing, right? And California has been one of just 5 states in the entire country that depolarized during this period. And I think that's even more impressive when you just focus on the western region of the country, because that region as a whole has polarized much more over that period than any other region of the country. Like the most polarizing states over the last 10 years have been Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, Texas, states in that region.
And states that also have closed partisan primary systems.
That's right.
So, okay. So these conversations are always fast and quick, and part of us prefers that. We're going to link to the thought leadership, Rich, your 2 white papers that you've written for the United American Institute. It's really good stuff. So we have Louisiana as an example. We have California as an example. We've talked about Alaska. Nevada's on the horizon for hopefully a second successful ballot initiative for Final Five voting. What is on your wish list? So your research points to the impact that nonpartisan primaries have had. You've suggested that getting rid of partisan primaries is sort of goal 1. What though beyond that would you like to see? I mean, what are the improvements that you might suggest for places like Louisiana or California, or frankly other states that are looking to take this journey?
Yeah. Um, so I said before that I'm still open, and my thinking is evolving, and as we get new research on the optimal system, right? Between top two, I don't like, I think for the benefits of Louisiana, I think that the timing of having runoff elections in January, those are very low turnout, right? People are not thinking about politics anymore at that point. So I think the timing of elections in Louisiana is not ideal. So there's improvements there. But point being, the debate about the top two system in California or Washington, something more akin to the Louisiana system, or a top four or a top five system, whether or not to include ranked choice voting and how you include it. I want to see more more states and more localities adopt those kind of policies. And I don't have a strong opinion on which exactly they should be adopting. To me, like I said before, the key sort of crux is that they get rid of partisan primaries, where only candidates from one party are competing against each other in the first stage of the election, and only and especially closed primaries where only voters of that party are deciding. Because what that produces is a Democrat who's far to the left of the ordinary voter and a Republican who's far to the right, right? And you get this distortion in representation. I think when we get rid of those partisan primaries, that in itself, whatever it is that we replace it with, that in itself is a huge improvement. And as an academic and a data nerd, I would like a lot more diversity in kinds of systems that we can examine, so we can continue to sort of like see what kinds of system work best, which kind of systems work best in what kind of places. So yeah, that's my hope.
That's great. And who was it? Thomas Jefferson that called these, the United States as the laboratories of democracy, and
Yeah, Louis Brandeis.
Louis Brandeis. And so it
Yeah.
can be that. It can be that. So I'm kind of with you, that every state could be having a conversation and that we could have more data. Rich, this has been phenomenal. Folks might want to get in touch with you. We're going to link, again, your thought leadership. Thanks for studying this issue. As you have new insights, we'd love to have you come back and share what you're learning in real time as election efforts and reforms get implemented in different places. And hopefully you can keep us smart on these issues as you continue to do your important research. So thanks for spending some time with us.
That sounds great. This is great, Todd. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'd love to hear from your members if they have thoughts and questions, comments.
It's great. Thanks again, Dr. Rich Barton.